Okay. Thank you everyone for joining us. This is going to be a little bit different meeting from our previous one. We're going to be talking all policy in these cases. So when we set these up, I really wanted to have robust conversations with folks that were already in and get presentations from people in other states, other programs, and stuff like that. And then our work group members also have a lot of experience as well. And it's important that when we go through and um, do these exercises, that we're listening to various different stakeholders and not undermining one over another. So now, with everything that we've talked about, we're kind of at the point um, at making some recommendations. Now, again, these aren't recommendations that are going to the MCCC right now, because typically, I think in October, they have a meeting where they discuss those recommendations. This is going to be, these are recommendations that go in the report, and that is required by law. So, and then these would help inform the recommendations that go in front of the MCCC next October. Any questions on that? Cool. I did add the recommendations to the meeting description if you want to take a look at those. Actually, we have to get through the procedural stuff first. Roll call. Let me start with that. Senator Benjamin Brooks.
Here.
Delegate Mike Rogers. The next is Tyler Abbott. I don't know if we announced this yet, but Tyler has taken a new position and has recused himself from this working group. So in the meantime, we're going to find another person. I'm going to be stepping in for MDE in the meantime, but we will be getting a new chair for this, or a new MDE representative, I should say. All right. Evie Schwartz.
Here.
Josh Kurtz. David Chai.
Here.
Diana Menendez, my understanding, she's moved to a different capacity. Same with Pearl Donahue. So we will be looking for some folks to take those seats. I've already reached out to NDA if they have any, or MEA if they have any recommendations. We would also be interested in recommendations from some of the other groups, some of the other members to kind of fill those roles that are currently vacant. David Bugleman.
Here.
Dacio No. And then Scott Elias. Okay. Well, I think we can move on. Let me just share my screen real quick. Okay, so in our last meeting, we talked about some of these items, and I was really just taking notes as we were talking. And then I also reviewed the notes that we post online because I might have missed something. And we do have Stephanie who is helping us take notes. So this is a compilation of the discussions that we've had in previous meetings, but more specifically our last meeting right here. So hopefully we can go through these individually. We can get some comments from the various different working group members, and then we can have a vote. We're going to do a majority rule for this. and with no filibusters. So and then those would be the recommendations coming from the advisory, or sorry, I'm on an advisory council. This is a working group. So so that's kind of the current thinking for how we're gonna put these recommendations in the report that the university is working on. Any questions on that? Cool. And let me just get my pen real quick. Okay, so I'm going to read through these. The General Assembly should consider a delay start landfill ban for solar PV modules between the years 2028 and 2035. So where those years came from, the 2035 was the assessment from some graduate students that David Comas is working with. But they were only necessarily looking at the start date of when the solar panels were installed. My recollection is, if I'm recalling that correctly, and then 2028, I think someone said 2027 in our last meeting, 2028. So that one's a little bit more arbitrary, but sometime between there. And the university is actually doing a more detailed assessment on like when the surge is going to be and when we would need something like that. So and then just adding some content, because a ban in itself is not that effective. So if a landfill ban is enacted now, solar panel owners, so now, as in, let's say the next year, since this would have to go through the legislative session, owners will just establish a default practice of shipping solar panels out of state to be disposed of. So we don't necessarily want to create another problem for one of our neighboring states. A delayed start will give the solar panel industry more time to prepare for the surge of solar panels coming offline in those years. So if there's investments that need to be made, contracts that need to be written up, need to work with zoning on particular things, it's a signal to the industry that, hey, we are serious about this, but we want to give you time. And the good news is we do have time, because the surge is going to be isn't happening tomorrow, but that we really need to start thinking about that. And then also, so the number 2 is more from like industry perspective. Number 3, a delayed start will give the state of Maryland, the General Assembly, more time to come up with adequate policy and funding mechanisms so that we are ready to divert if and when that landfill ban happens. Any questions on that? Robert?
Yeah, thank you, Bradley. This is Bob Nicholson with Solar Energy Industry Association. One question or point that I would make is, under this provision for the delay, is there any consideration to collecting data during that period of time?
Yeah.
So, and the point being, the best way to incentivize recyclers to enter the space is to show them that volumes, 1, exist, and 2, are increasing.
So as a part of the, sorry, the work that that the University of Maryland and Johns Hopkins are working on right now, is that data, like when are things going to be coming offline? They in, I think it was maybe a meeting or 2 ago, they showed some of that data on the 19th. They're actually going to be doing a full report out on their findings for that. So maybe that's a number 4. Is that what you're suggesting for this? That this will be supported by data? Decisions will be supported by, maybe you have a better way of phrasing it.
No, I think that will do it. It would be good to have some idea of how much material actually does find its way to landfill over that period of time.
cell for, assuming there is enough supply to support solar recycling, reuse, refurbishment, and repair. How does that sound?
That's great. Thank you, Bradley.
Cool. I think David, you were next.
Thanks, Bradley. One thing that comes to mind looking at this is making sure there's some ability for exemptions to these requirements to the extent that there aren't necessary facilities. I don't know what that would look like, but since we're talking about things kind of happening in the future, I think having some escape hatch to avoid a scenario where things just will not be able to work in reality would be important. I'll leave it to other folks to figure out what that is, but wanted to point that out.
So I've never read a law that doesn't have exemptions. So I'm sure there will be exemptions that are negotiated.
So just to be clear, I'm not thinking of exemptions necessarily. I was thinking, I mean, maybe it is an exemption, but it would like apply to the extent that the requirements are not feasible, right? And that would be maybe a determination further in the future. But we could talk more about what that could look like. But that's what I was thinking. Not really like an exemption to a particular circumstance now. It's sort of allowing for a scenario where there's issues complying with this in the future.
So can I say there's enough to practically supply and practically supply? That doesn't make, there's enough to supply supporting and support. Would that help? I'm sure we're going to have that conversation on if and when this would apply, and because the conditions may not be right.
Yeah, I think that's on track. I mean, I'd probably want to think about if we need some more precise language, but I think it's on track.
And again, this is just the recommendation too. This recommendation goes to the report, which is going to the General Assembly, and then we can refine these, and we'll have another 10 months to refine these when we go to the MCCC next year, if that makes sense.
Yep, sounds good.
Okay. Was there another question? Cool. If I might want to do, or we can vote at the end, or we can vote as we go. I think my preference would be to vote as we go. So I'm going to ask folks to, if you are on the working group, to put your vote in the chat, because we will want to, we will want to document these votes on as written. Are we comfortable putting this in a recommendation to in the report that's due, or that we're going to be delivering by the end of this year? And that goes to the General Assembly, knowing that we will have more chances to revise these for the MCCC next year. And if you want to put your votes in the chat, that will be great.
I don't see it.
Senator Benjamin Brooks.
Yes, I'm trying to find the part where I.
Oh, I see. Okay, so so you see the two people, and it says, it should say like a number 19. Just to the right of that is where you can put your vote.
Okay, hold on. Oh yes, I see. Gotcha. Just to the right of that. Gotcha. Okay.
There is a voting mechanism in here, but it doesn't tell you who voted, and really this part is for
Good.
if you're on the working group.
Bradley, did you
Yeah.
want to include if people wanted to abstain? I'm sorry, also.
That too, yeah. If folks want to abstain, I don't know if I can vote on Tyler's behalf, but I'll vote now, and we can figure out what that means officially later.
Riley, to be clear, are we voting on the
Yeah.
specific verbiage or the general principles right now?
This would be
Is this the exact language that we are intending to recommend, word for word?
this is the recommendation that is going to go into the report. So it would be copy pasted, and we can have some more discussion around that. And I tried to keep it high level too, as well. Did you have other comments or concerns about that? Maybe we can make some.
Well, I mean, because you were explaining, for example, the rationale for the dates in the prefatory clause in 2028 to 2035. I
Yeah.
think there needs to be some explanation there. All right. There's also, I think, some clarity that if a person was not in our conversation now, they might ask, well, are you intending for the delay to start in 2028, 2029, 2035, or some date in between? Because I mean, I understand what we're saying here because we're in this conversation, but based on just this text alone, that's not entirely clear. So I mean, I understand that for our purposes, we can talk about the principles, but that's why I was asking in terms of the precise verbiage. If we're using this, you're asking us to vote on the exact language that you want to go into the report.
Right. So we're not saying which year it is in this. So we're given a range, and it could be any of those dates in there, knowing that's when looking at the modeling, looking at some of the research that the graduate students have done, that is when some of this infrastructure is going to need to be put in place so that if we're going to divert, then there is an outlet for those materials. So we can put some clarity, a disclaimer on this. So
Right. Yeah. I mean, I just don't know if you want to get into the practice, if you want us to wordsmith right now, or if you just want us to vote on the general idea, right? Because I think, for example, in the language in that first sentence, it could read something to the effect of the General Assembly should consider the delayed start to a landfill ban for solar photovoltaic modules to begin sometime in the years between 2028 and 2035. But again, I don't know if you really want to get into wordsmithing right now, or if you just want us to vote on the general principles. You see what I'm saying here? It could be very tedious.
yeah, and then the General Assembly would pick the date and the start date essentially in the law.
I think
So
we're not going to be able to vote unless we're wordsmithing it today. Like, this is what's going in the report. That's how I feel about it. So offer that suggestion now and add it in, because that makes me more comfortable with my vote as well.
yeah, so I'll say this range is when the anticipated and surge of panels is expected to occur. Now, the model that is currently being developed, there's a famous saying that all models are wrong, some are informative. And so we are making reasonable assumptions in that modeling, but that doesn't mean that it's going to be that year, like when we see that surge. So I did add that this range is when the anticipated surge of panels or decommissioned panels is expected to occur.
David's wording was good though, for what you mean by between the
Right.
years.
Yeah. So, yeah. Sorry. I'm not trying to belabor the point, right? Because if you read it now, it says, are you trying to say that this is the range for the ban? it's only going to last for those 7 years. Or you're
I
likely-
see.
I mean, I know that
No,
I know
no,
what we're
that's-
trying to say. I'm just saying that
Yeah.
there's ambiguity in the language as it's currently written.
So the delayed start, which will
To
start
begin.
To begin, right.
and, oh, I see. I wasn't picking up what you were putting down. Now I am. Okay. So, starting in the years between the years. Okay. So you asked for context, and then we had that clarification or the explanation, and then we added that clarification. Are you comfortable with that?
Yeah, I think that first sentence is okay.
Okay. So we have 4 yeses. David, you had some, sounds like you had a comment. Did you want to talk through that?
Yeah, I just wanted to make clear, I'm thinking about utility scale developers that need CPCNs. And, as I've said before, there's effectively a landfill ban for any project that needs a decommissioning plan approved by the PSC, because PPRP's condition requires the solar panels to be recycled, and there's mechanisms built into that. It creates a financial incentive for developers to include recycling and reuse in their plans. So I wanted to make it clear that's from an industry perspective what I'm thinking about. I don't know if there is a concern from rooftop type developers when you're dealing with individual homeowners and what this could look like for them. So I think it would be important to try to get that perspective if there isn't somebody on, to make sure we're not creating problems for that part of the market. But at least from utility scale, in a way, I think this is sort of expanding what exists for them already. And so I think from that perspective, I don't see an issue with this.
So I put non-PPRP.
Well, no, that changes the recommendation so that undos are yeses. I think it's just recognizing that David's vote
yeah,
represents
I
a
think
segment of the
it's fine
industry.
to not. Yeah, I think it can apply to utility scale. I was just trying to make clear that I don't know if this would create problems for other types of solar developers,
Yeah.
like residential and maybe small commercials. So it's important to understand that, and I can't speak to that.
So we did invite some of the residential folks. Is anyone online? Robert?
Yeah, thank you, Bradley. So I think if the question is, will ultimately the landfill ban impact residential owners? I think the answer to that is no, as long as a reasonable infrastructure has been identified for managing those panels. So we support, for residential panels, we support the development of communications to help residential panel owners understand that there are outlets and options other than landfill for managing the panels at a reasonable cost.
Shannon, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to compound with what Bob was driving at. So in order for the market to be there, in order to signal that, right, the way this is a chicken and egg production piece on when you consider the smaller scale comparatively to the larger utility scale. And so the driving force obviously is the utility scale, just because of the sheer quantity that they are generating at one particular instance. But the goal here is not to just delay. The intention behind a landfill ban is to help promote that industry to come forward.
Right. And that's why we're given time as well. With off ramps if the infrastructure isn't there. So if some of the other working group members that are on, David Chai, is Staciono on? Or Scott Elias?
do we have a quorum of the people that need to vote on this, Bradley? I
That's a
hate
good
to
question.
be a stick in the mud on that, but kind of goes to my concern. I just want to make sure we're looking at this from all angles. It's part of my anxiety here.
Yeah, so that is a good question. I don't know. Does anyone know offhand what a quorum, what the definition of that is for the purposes of public meetings?
So with the other working group meetings, they've been quite vague on what a quorum is. We've gone with majority, but I think it's up to the chair to determine that.
Okay, and Tyler was our chair, and he has recused himself from this. I would want to be consistent with what the other groups are doing, what the other working groups are doing. And if they are doing majority, then that's probably what we should do for the sake of consistency. And it's all a part of the same group, working groups. And with that, if we have 4 people, I don't know if we're at a quorum. So what I think we can do is we can talk through these. We can send out a Google Sheet to folks to vote on. And because it sounds like we just don't have a quorum, unfortunately. So I think that's what we'll do. We'll send out a Google Sheet to the advisory council members. We'll get votes, but we'll talk through each one of these items right now. Cool. Are we ready to move on to the second one? Okay. And just so folks know, we're trying to finish the report, I believe, by 11:14. If we don't get this done, these particular recommendations, we might have to add the recommendations as an addendum to the report. But the university's timeline is to get it done by the 14th. And that's when or 15th. It's one of those days. And that's when the other reports from the other working groups are going to be delivered as well. Okay. So the next one, the General Assembly should consider post-consumer recyclability goals. Now, for folks who don't know what post-consumer recyclability is, I'll just briefly explain that. So in let's say, and this is more applicable in let's say packaging, for example, or beverage containers. PCR is the amount of recyclable material that is in that particular product. So if I have, let's say, a wine bottle, 30% of that, if 30% of that is PCR, 30% of it is made of recyclable materials. Some laws have tiered approaches. So by this year, it needs to be 15%. This year needs to be 30%. This year needs to be 50%. So we aren't necessarily defining what those tiers are. And that can be done later in legislation. But the concept of PCR is something that the General Assembly should consider. And that can be a tiered, phased approach as well. Any questions on that one? Bob?
Thanks, Bradley. Just for clarification, so what this is saying is that we're talking about a goal for post-consumer recyclability in existing panels, or
No, it'd be future. It'd be future panels sold.
so is this referring to using post-consumer content?
Materials. So it would be so, and you could split it up by the different materials that are in solar panels, because you have plastic, metal, glass, in there, and there may be different feasibility for those different. So you could have goals for each one of those. But let's say the metal would be made out of 50% recycled content by this year, would be an example of what this is.
Okay, so it's a recycled content in the manufacturing process.
Correct. Yep.
Okay.
Mhm. Not
Thank-
that we are recycling 20% of panels. It's the recycled content in the development of those panels.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
Yep. And maybe that should be clarified because I'm using jargon PCR, and in the recycling world, folks know what that means. But yeah, we can clarify that.
So it's the utilization of post-consumer materials in the manufacturing of new panels.
Correct.
Perfect. Thank you.
Bradley, quick question. Would that greatly increase the cost of the product?
So there's a potential for that. There's two ways to kind of reduce the cost, at least that come up to my mind. One, those costs could be subsidized somewhere, and then two, as you start to scale up, the recyclability, you can take advantage of the economies of scale, which could potentially would be less of a hit, essentially. But it all depends on the markets too.
I see.
Like with like plastic, sometimes it can be pegged to like the oil prices.
Mhm.
So if oil is like really expensive, the market turns to recycled materials.
All right. Mhm. All right. Okay. Thanks.
Yeah. Paul? And go ahead. Okay. Paul, did you have something? Although we do have comments for the general public at the end of these meetings too. So with that being said, I'll move to David.
Thanks, Bradley. I just wanted to kind of piggyback on what's under Brooks, his question. I would be concerned about any type of requirement like this. I mean, it says goal, but this is like an actual requirement on panels that are sold or used in Maryland. I'd be concerned about cost impacts, about feasibility. Recognizing Maryland is a pretty small market, and I think it's important for us to be careful about those practicalities and sort of balancing the need to be able to deploy these systems versus these goals. I mean, I'm not saying the goal in and of itself is a bad one, but if we really harm the market because of it, that's a problem.
So just as an example of what I've seen in other laws or like requirements like this. So there was a requirement for state agencies to use compost. And in there, they had some wiggle room language that said if it didn't increase the price by 10%, I think was the threshold, then if it didn't increase the price by 10%, then you had to do it. And if it didn't, then you didn't have to do it. So that's maybe there's some wiggle room language.
I don't want to belabor the point, but especially for utility scale, this is a competitive region. It's not just Maryland sort of having goals within the state. We're also competing against other states. There's a lot of corporate off-takers competing on price.
Sure.
And we just want to avoid a situation where we make Maryland a non-competitive market for these projects. That's my main concern.
Right. It's much like the landfill ban. Having PCR puts pressure on developing recycling markets as well.
Yeah. And again, I mean, it's literally, if you're thinking about getting a soda in like a plastic bottle, I mean, everyone's going to buy that stuff. But This is a little bit different in terms, or very different in terms of kind of the market we're talking about. And we just need to be sensitive and careful not to disrupt the ability of developers to do projects here.
So we added it to a recommendation below, but the goal, we added this clarifying language. The goal should take into account consumer affordability, the cost of recycling, and Maryland's renewable energy goals. If we had language like that, does that make you more comfortable with this recommendation?
Not really, to be frank. Because
Bradley, I mean,
it's
the
not,
intent of this
you know, like what
goal-
does consumer affordability mean, right? Because when you, again, I'm not speaking for rooftop developers, but you're sort of, those developers to a certain extent are competing against the utility, right? Because there's the calculation, if I do a rooftop system, how much am I going to save? You know, is that consumer affordability in the same sense as, you know, we're imposing a requirement on packaging for consumer products that you buy at Target? I think it's a little bit different. And then utility scale, it's a completely different equation, right? So that's my initial reaction. I mean, I could sort of take it back and think about it.
Well, yeah, and we'll be asking folks to vote on these. And if we don't
Yep.
vote for this language exactly, we have another bite at the apple with the MCCC. So keep that in mind
Yeah, okay.
as well. David, we'll go to you next. And then Pascal, since you aren't on the board or on the working group, I would ask that maybe if you want to put your comment in the chat, that'd be fine as well. And then maybe one of my staff can help answer that. But I'll go to David next.
Yeah, so I think again, with respect to the verbiage, right, we're saying should consider, and we're using the phrase goals, right? So is it your intention that the work group should explicitly recommend, by this bullet, I mean, is explicitly recommending PCR, or we're just asking the General Assembly to think about it, essentially?
To consider it. Yes.
All right. Yeah. So then, you know, I have a little bit less heartburn with some of the concerns that David raised. If we're just recommending that the General Assembly consider it, I do think that the language should incorporate different factors that we would recommend the General Assembly take into consideration as they weigh that, you know, including some of the factors that David mentioned and that you've brought up with this sub bullet here.
And again, we'll send, yes, I think that's all good discussion. I did put phased goals because it's pretty common in PCR. It's not like next year you need 90% recycled material. There is they phase them intentionally because the markets can't turn on a dime necessarily.
Yeah, and if we're, I mean, if we're going through the hoops of wordsmithing right now, I might suggest the following language for the group's consideration. The General Assembly should consider the efficacy of post-consumer recyclability PCR phase goals in the manufacturer. So I would insert the word consider the efficacy of before the PCR phrase. There should be a pair of them. And then, I mean, I think the sub bullet is good. You know, I may pose a question to the group. Are there other factors to take into consideration when weighing the PCR, including, for example, cost, as David has already raised, but also sustainability and so forth. You know, it's not an exhaustive list. I think that's why I think if you use the word including or something like that too, just to signal that these are not necessarily the only factors to take into consideration, but just several that the group is highlighting. So you could say something like the goal should take into account factors such as, or, you know, something else, something
Oh,
of that.
yeah. That's a good way to do it. Yeah, I
Consider-
don't know why.
under consideration, take
Go
into consideration factors such as,
Oh, yeah, consideration.
right.
Cool. All right, and we can make sure that we have the language, if we want to use it in other places as well. David, I did miss your first, because I was typing, I did miss your first
Oh,
comment.
I would just insert the word, the phrase, the efficacy of after consider and then before post.
All right. Cool. Are we ready to move on to the next one?
We vote?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, what was that?
I don't think we voted.
So we're not voting. We don't have a
Okay.
quorum.
Okay.
Yep.
We're
But
just
I will send,
voting.
I will send out a Google sheet to the working group members. And then these won't be anonymous votes also, just FYI. Okay. All right. So the General Assembly should consider, now this is kind of a two-parter, implementing incentives to bring bring a solar panel recycler to Maryland, or work with surrounding states to establish a regional solar recycler. Abby?
So for this one, MEA would like to suggest removing from, it should be the General Assembly should consider removing implementing incentives to bring a solar recycler Maryland, and just go to should consider working with surrounding states to establish a regional recycler. And you could add a clause that says, including considering Maryland sites, but we would take issue to the incentives for Maryland specifically.
What are some other folks' thoughts on that, on the working group?
Sorry, Abby, could you repeat that one more time?
So our motion would be to remove everything from after consider, remove implementing incentives to bring a solar panel recycler to Maryland, and just have it read, the General Assembly should consider working with surrounding states to establish a regional solar recycler, including considering Maryland sites.
So is it MEA's position to refrain from using incentives at all? Or would
Yeah.
incentives possibly play into a regional program?
We're proposing that we work with surrounding states to discuss the recycler, but are not comfortable voting for incentives at this time.
Okay, all right, got it, thank you.
Okay. What are some other folks' thoughts on that? So we would essentially take out the highlighted area, and then at the end, which could include Maryland sites.
Yeah.
Senator Brooks, do you have any thoughts?
I'm, I'm thinking, hold on, the General Assembly should consider implementing incentives to bring a solar panel recycler to Maryland. You know, I think it would be good if we were to do things to get those recyclers to come here, but that would be creating jobs in Maryland, you know, and I think that that's part of the goal. So when we speak of incentives, we're talking about something to influence or offer some type of credit or some type of dollars or something like that. So yeah, I'm still trying to go back to what Evie was saying, but I thought you were saying basically saying the same thing, but just moving it around. Evie?
It moves it around, but it makes the focuses on the the region, and we're looking for one in this region, and we can consider Maryland, but it doesn't presume that we already know the answer to whether it's possible to get one in Maryland
Yeah,
by doing it that way.
I
Like
see.
the sense we got from I mean, if we look just from the presentations we've had, then the projections of what to expect, I don't think we can presume right now that there's economies of scale for one to be in Maryland anytime soon. And so the incentives would likely have to be very, very, very expensive. Doesn't mean that couldn't be considered, but like the wording makes it
Yeah,
about
I think I see what you're
goal is
saying.
to get one. The goal is to get one to the region, and then it's more of a secondary goal that if it's possible to do in Maryland, then Maryland could be selected, but doesn't, instead of starting with the Maryland.
Yeah.
as the primary.
Yeah, what I'm thinking that it would be easier for us to offer Maryland incentives if it's going to create jobs in Maryland. You know, it would make it an easier lift. Because right now, some of the concerns of, you know, we're sending dollars out of the state of Maryland to other states when it comes to energy, you know. So if we could keep it in Maryland, it would make the lift a little easier. So,
And just to add on, my staff do have a legislative, are required by, or one of the programs is the legislator is wanting us to bring recyclers to the state of Maryland. So we are actively working on that. We're not necessarily providing incentives, but we're trying to connect folks with potential recyclers and helping them through, like connecting them with zoning people, commerce, whatnot. So just to add some context for that. Mike, or Delegate Mike Rogers.
Yeah, I just want to sort of echo some of the sentiments of Senator Brooks. I mean, we're always looking to bring jobs to Maryland. We can do that to be, the language and possible incentives. Then I think that makes sense. I mean, when you're talking about a structural deficit, we need jobs, we need revenue here. And I understand folks that you may happen. That's heartfelt. But to the extent that we can get those jobs here, it sort of poses a win. And not to say, the language doesn't have to dictate that, but certainly to the extent that we influence it with how we're drafting it, I think that's a win-win.
And the language doesn't dictate that because we have this or.
No,
Right.
correct.
Yeah.
Saying that it was.
Yeah.
I was just saying that one, again, I concur with the sentiments of Senator Brooks, but to go a step further, I think we do need to try to get those jobs here to the extent that we can.
and Bradley, if I could say this as well, I think that probably would lend itself to us assisting in the previous recommendation, that's the PCR goals, because if we start doing things to make it easier to recycle, and that would lend itself to that circular economy that eventually that we're trying to get to.
So what we can do is we can send out both versions to the group and have the group vote on both. I am hearing that there's a strong desire to bring jobs to the state of Maryland.
Right.
Just and many of you maybe, I'm sure do. When we go into legislative session, the first thing that we're going to hear is something similar to, if your bill has a fiscal note, it's dead because don't have money. And so to the extent that we can create or generate additional revenue, that will certainly spark interest by both the administration and the legislature.
So I have both here, and Cool.
All right.
All right. Ed, cool. So the next one is the General Assembly should require solar panels decommissioned in Maryland. And we can soften this up by saying should consider requiring to be sent to a certified recycler with acceptable certification like R2 or eStewards. It should be noted that there are no certified recyclers right now. That's my understanding. There may be in the future. So, but this is, we really want to make sure that solar panels are actually being recycled. Electronics recycling has had a very storied history with CRTs being abandoned in warehouses. We're now starting to see that a little bit with batteries. So we really want to make sure that this is legitimate recycling, and having that certification and where folks are actually checking, hey, this is actually getting recycled, helps with that. Helps with that credibility. Evie?
All right. I just put my wordsmithing in the chat this time to help. This one, the intent of this one is about this recycler being certified, but you could read this the way it's read now, that all panels decommissioned have to be recycled. So I was just trying to wordsmith to make it about, if it's being recycled, that the recycler is certified. Oops, and I meant to get rid of a comma.
I think that makes sense. I'm fine switching that out if that will help.
Not actually changing the intent.
Yeah, I see what Evie's saying there. I think that makes sense.
Okay. Any other comments on that one? With that new, better language?
I'm fine with it.
Cool. All right. If there are no other comments, I'll move to the next one. So the General Assembly should consider the development of a stewardship organization, typically a nonprofit, to help manage the end-of-life collection of residential solar panels. Residents who own their solar panels may not have considered the full costs, complexity, or plans for decommissioning of their systems. Now, the reason this stemmed around a conversation, many of the stakeholders felt like that there was already a robust system for handling end-of-life management for utility scale solar. We talked about requiring the bonding, the plans that are approved under PPRP. So this is really just focused on residential, where you have someone who may not have an entire environmental consulting team to help them with the decommissioning of those panels. They're a normal person living their life. So it's the stewardship organization would help with the end of life management. Now, and this there's something similar. We've seen something like this with Paint Care, with that would be considered a stewardship organization where they help with the complexity of like trying to find an appropriate place to send these particular materials. And that is a very successful program throughout the states that have implemented it. And we're implementing that program in the state of Maryland in the next year. So we're pretty excited about that.
Thanks, Brandon. Sidebar, that was my bill.
Yes, I know. I mean, we just went to a conference and I was this past week and I was speaking with the Paint Care folks in New York, and that is a example of a industry that has really taken responsibility of trying to responsibly manage the end of life for paint.
Yes. Yes, indeed. Okay.
Evie, I see you have, well, I should read the rest. Well, I already kind of talked about that. Just more at length and mentioning pain care. So what are folks' thoughts on this one? And Evie, I see you have your hand up.
Also not a substantive change. It's just the sub bullets, right, are the context versus the main bullet is the recommendation, and the second
Sub bullet is the context.
Yes.
Yeah.
the second
on-
sentence also seems like context more than being part of the
Um,
recommendation. So it could be
It
two.
is. No,
two
you know, you're
contexts.
right. It is. That was, I forget who brought that up. That might have been Scott that brought it up, that really we're talking about residents who own theirs, because if you're under like a rental agreement or something like that, it might not apply, because that company might have the know-how and the resources to handle those. So I think that's good context. Okay.
Okay, residents who own this other council. This one.
And that's why we're not recommending a stewardship organization for utility solar.
Mhm. Mhm. I'm fine with that, with that recommendation. So, and I'm glad that you're pointing that out now. I am the owner of solar panels, so but when the salesperson was making the pitch, you know, we had decommissioning never ever came up. So
Hey, I just got my solar panels, and I'm gonna have to think about this too. So, any other thoughts on this recommendation? All right.
Just a question. Recommendation is fine, and just because this esteemed group of folks probably may know the answer. I was by a custodian this morning who happens to pastor a church in the district, and he mentioned to me a program where Maryland was trying to lease land, plant solar panels. Is that a thing, or did I miss something?
At least for me, you were cutting it in a little bit up and then out. Can I ask that you repeat yourself? Sorry about that.
No, absolutely. So I was intrigued just by a pastor who has about 35 acres of land, and he said, "Delegate, can you tell me about?" I understood that Maryland had a program where they were trying to lease land for solar. And I said, I wasn't familiar with that program, and if it exists, then who the point of
That may be DNR, but I don't know if Bob is still on. I think he said that he had to get off.
I'll reach out to DNR.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it's DNR.
Or some senator might have had some information, since all of these are his bills.
no, I what I do know, I know, especially on farmland, you have a lot of folks who
Yeah.
to prevent from using fertile land for the erection of solar panels. You know, now there is something we call agrivoltaic, where you could do panels and still grow certain crops that doesn't need as much sun. But for the most part, they try to discourage all taking any fertile land out of inventory for panels. Yeah. So, but I could do some additional research on that for you if need be.
Yes, sir. I'll call you.
Okay, got enough.
All right. So are we good sending now, again, not the recommendation, but sending this out to vote?
I'm good with it.
All right. The General Assembly should consider establishing incentives to promote reuse, repair, refurbishment, or donation of solar panels before recycling is considered. The goal is to keep panels, um, and this is reuse, repair, refurbishment, donation in Maryland would be a priority or a goal.
Yes.
Abby?
You're getting sick of me. All right, two substantive recommendations for this one. One is in the refurbishment part to add refurbishment and recertification, recognizing that when panels are refurbished, they would need to be recertified or else they wouldn't have a warranty. And then that will become a barrier to actually deploying them.
Agreed.
Most programs. Okay. The second piece is to have a discussion about that second sentence. This is very double barreled. The first sentence on its own is a recommendation. The second sentence doesn't have to be true to support the first sentence. So I'd like to separate those and also discuss the goal of keeping panels inside of the state. I think that the goal is to make sure there's a life cycle for the panels and it's not always going to landfills, but I'm not sure I totally understand why we care where they then ultimately get deployed. Why can't the secondary market just be nationwide?
Yeah, I think when we were talking about this, that the recyclers would be like if the recycler, like just because you have the scrap, let's say you're recycling the metal and then the scrap metal, those could still go to markets within Maryland. So you're kind of keeping that revenue and tax base in Maryland. I think that's when we wrote this up, that was kind of the thinking of that. It wasn't, it's really more just make sure you look, but it's not a definitive. Or it doesn't disqualify the incentive either. It's just if there is a market that is in Maryland, that they should consider that before another one.
Well,
Any,
or,
oh, go ahead.
what about the goal is to promote jobs in Maryland?
Recycling jobs.
Yeah, recycle in Maryland.
Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah.
Would or
So
it,
that has more to do with the
yeah, maybe this needs to be
it's
reworded. a
more
little bit.
about the task of the refurbishment and the recycling. I
Yeah,
thought that the sentence
I see
meant
that.
that like once there's a new product available and it's being sold on the secondary market, that we would restrict that market.
No. I think it's the reuse, repair, refurbishment, and recertification and donation would be in Maryland.
Okay.
Not necessarily the final product when it is
Resold.
redeveloped.
Okay.
Yeah. So maybe we can. Oh, the goal would be that these activities would be.
So basically, you mean the goal is like having a local closed loop supply chain almost, so to speak.
Yes. Yeah. That's a excellent. The goal would be to have a local closed loop.
I'm not saying I would use that language, but I'm just paraphrasing in terms of
That was very elegant language. I liked it.
Okay.
Especially as I was struggling to come out with something less elegant than that. Okay.
I like that. Yeah. All right.
And we can say priority instead of goal right here. It's because that would, the connotation would be look at Maryland first and then other places second.
Okay. Sounds good.
Okay, what are some folks' thoughts on this? And just to do a time check, we have about 20 minutes and we have 2 more recommendations to talk about.
Well, silence is affirmation, right?
All right, sounds good.
I
Okay,
guess
the next,
just anticipating voting next time. Could there be 2 versions of this one to vote on as well? One with that second sentence, one without.
um,
If this is a double-barreled recommendation, I still want to be able to. Yeah, I haven't decided, but as our official position, but on that second sentence, because that's so new and totally different. But next time we want to be able to still be able to vote on the first sentence, even if you don't support the second sentence.
yeah, we can do that.
Thanks.
Okay.
Mhm.
The General Assembly should consider funding a workforce development. Should this be planned or I don't know, or requiring regulation to reduce breakage during decommissioning and transportation due to gaps in labor training and insufficient shipping practices. So is this really just like a kind of like if you get a haircut, you have to be a competent person and get a certification. If you're going to be transporting solar panels, you also have to be a competent person. I don't necessarily remember this one, but
Would that require some type of special training to as opposed to an actual certification? So like
I
if you're
think-
normally a truck driver and you do long haul or you do recyclable waste, you maybe have to have an extra 4-hour, 6-hour class to be able to haul this. Is that what we're looking at, or?
it could be, and there may be a test too. Yeah, I think that was the thinking because we really want to make sure that people are trained to move panels and aren't breaking them along the way because they become less valuable or it costs more to repair them.
But would that not be covered under if the companies that we're seeking are certified recyclers? Would they not have the technical? Would that not require the technical skill needed in order to handle or to decommission the panels?
It could be. Sometimes the service provider that's picking up the panels isn't always the recycler too.
Okay.
I guess I see it, and this is not a perfect analogy where, you may have someone that has an alcohol license, but for someone to be an establishment to be an actual bartender, there's some
Mhm.
additional training that person has to have to be the bartender, even though the establishment may already own the liquor license.
So it could be a permit instead. Like if you want to transport solar panels, you have to have a permit. That could be, I think, closer to what you're talking about, Delegate.
No, that's fine.
David?
Well, I don't know if we want to require a permit because that might be a greater barrier to entry. I mean, I think honestly, this is a recommendation that we need a little bit more insight and advice from folks in the trades on this particular piece. To require a permit for the transport of solar panels, I think would potentially limit the needed workforce in that area. It might put up an unnecessary regulatory burden on agencies to have to certify and license and permit, another class of employees.
I think that's a fair point on this one. What are some other folks' thoughts? David?
I agree with David on this. And I think another thing is we need to think about is this a solution in search of a problem, frankly, because I'm not convinced that there's really going to be an issue of breakage during decommissioning or transportation. And to the extent that is something that a recycler or whoever's sort of off taking the decommissioned panels cares about, I'm sure they'll be able to deal with that, privately through whatever contract they have with the company removing the equipment. So I'm just not convinced this is really an issue that we need to solve here.
Abby?
I would say we got feedback during the presentation to this group as well as in other contexts. There have been several presenters who have talked about this as an issue. So I do think there has been feedback and sufficient that there's training needed for the workforce, and that decommissioning and taking apart solar panels and shipping them is different than other types of activities. That being said, I understand the pushback about the regulatory approach. And so potentially you could just strike the or requiring regulation and just make this about workforce development.
Yeah, I think it's two related but distinct issues, right? Because I think as a general matter, we want, of course, to reduce breakage and to be promoting worker health and safety, and just general health and safety. There may be even regulations that go toward that inform best practices of it. But I think my initial comment earlier was, do you really need to have, for example, a licensed decommissioner? I can see, for example, you want to have a licensed recycling facility, but you need a license to transport the actual materials. There's a difference, I think, in transporting solar panels and then having best practices and regulations to reduce breakage, as opposed to having to license someone who is transporting, nuclear waste or oil and gas, right, which has a much higher public health hazard, where the state would want to regulate the actual transportation much more strictly beyond just mere standards.
I guess sort of hearing the response to what I said, I mean, I think the idea of offering training could make sense. But I am concerned about, as David said, creating like a separate licensing process for this very, very sort of niche thing. I guess one other thing that comes to mind is, again, if panels are being removed to then be sold to a company that's going to refurbish and sell them again, I mean, clearly there's an incentive baked into that transaction to, make sure the panels aren't damaged. So I don't know if we need to get into the business of regulating the actual activity of removal and transport with respect to solar panels. But again, the idea of training makes sense to sort of increase awareness, and especially for homeowners and sort of general contractors and maybe working on residential systems. There's probably a role for training there.
All right. So I'm hearing multiple folks taking or requiring regulation. I put /training with workforce development. Are folks fine with those changes?
I'm good with it. Yeah.
To Abby?
The other question is whether you want to replace the word funding with incentives, just because incentives can be financial and non-financial. So it's just even more broad.
All right. Good call, Abby.
We'll put your name on our website as a trained person. All right. I can think of no greater honor than that. Okay. We're on our last one. We have 14 minutes left. This was around, well, I'll read it first. The General Assembly should consider an advanced recovery fee for residential solar to help pay for the stewardship organization costs of collection and processing of solar panels owned by residents. So again, we have very similar language. The fee should take into account consumer affordability, costs of recycling, and Maryland's renewable energy goals. the assumption is that recycling costs will reduce in the future. So again, with economies of scale, if we start to recycle more, then when the surge comes, then hopefully prices will be less per unit than they are now. All right. Abby?
Did you skip number 9?
So number 9 isn't really a recommendation. So the recommendation is recommend financing mechanisms analyzed under 9 right here.
Okay, well, I guess I had one for number 9 though, which was instead of just analyze, to have MDE conduct a study. I wanted to discuss whether we want to recommend that, like the actual mechanism for analyzing. And then it ties to number 10, makes it going to number 10, that like 10 is actually based on number 9, like the results of a study could affect what kind of funding mechanism we want to go for. And 10 kind of presumes the results of number 9 and says we've already chosen an advanced recovery fee as the solution.
Well, as I was looking through the notes, I only saw really one reference to a funding mechanism, and that was the advanced recovery fee. So that's more why there's only one right here. David?
Yeah, the all caps language, Bradley, is that the language that's from the statute, or?
Yeah, it is.
That's statute. All right, so the all caps in 9 and 10 are both statutory language.
Correct. Yes.
All right, got it. Okay.
Ah, okay. That's why it's all caps. Okay. Well, I guess our recommendation for number 10 then was based on the results of number 9, the General Assembly should consider a funding mechanism and not already presume advanced recovery fee. But if number 9 was us, then
yeah, it was that.
Okay.
When looking at the notes, that was really the only funding mechanism that popped up.
Okay.
Doesn't mean that there aren't others, but that was the one that we talked about.
Mhm.
So then maybe the recommendation would then be to consider is further study on funding mechanisms after.
And MDE thinks MEA is better at conducting studies.
No, thank you.
I think that's our official position. All right.
Then I take back my motion.
So the General Assembly should consider
We said further studies, what you said, Abby?
Yeah, further study on the funding mechanisms
Yeah, okay. Yes.
conducted by MDE.
well, DNR since Bob left. So
Funding this study, okay.
to determine appropriate end of life management. Financing sources for residential EV solar panel. And then are we taking this one out then?
That's our recommendation. I don't know what the other members think.
What are some other folks?
I was liking the stewardship part. Because at least with that, it would be a less problematic cost to those folks who have panels, and then when they do reach the end of life, then at least there's something in place to help mitigate, those challenges for them. Let's see, the General Assembly.
And we can vote for both too, also. That's, that's fine as well.
Yeah, I like to do both. Yes.
Okay.
If I may, you could just insert some language at the end of the first bullet, Bradley. So solar panels, comma, taking into consideration such factors as, and then you can, list the various factors that the group would want to consider, including but not limited to, the cost of financing a stewardship option, and also taking into the cost of the other different factors that we've talked about here, including affordability.
It would be, I can just copy paste these. And that is the context, so I will indent that one then.
Well, I like that. I'm good with that.
Okay. So this is probably the first time that a working group has gotten through all of the recommendations in one go. And it wasn't just one or two, it was a whole bunch. So I want to congratulate this working group on being the most efficient working group out there. So thank you for that. I will put these recommendations to, I'll put them in a Google document or a Google Sheet. I will send those out to the working group members. And then if we can get votes sometime next week, I know we're trying to get the report done by the 15th. That would be helpful.
Okay.
And again, we're going to have another bite at the apple. So we have a lot of this should consider language. That doesn't necessarily mean it's going to happen.
Mhm.
We will be making formal recommendations to the MCCC next October. Abby?
So are you proposing squeezing in another meeting before the 15th? Or are we voting on the 15th?
So we are going to, we do have a meeting. Our next meeting is on the 19th or the 18th. So that's when the universities are going to be reporting out on the findings of their study. So we will have another one, but they will have delivered their portion of the report already at that point. So that will be their final report. So we may have to maybe add these recommendations as an addendum, or we can try and have another meeting before that to review how the voting went. Or talk about it at the 18th meeting, the results. What are some folks' thoughts on that?
I
Well,
mean,
Oh, go ahead, Debbie.
nope, I defer to you.
No, ladies always first.
Oh, I was just gonna say voting with a meeting is usually preferred because then we can have discussion with each rec before taking an official vote.
Again, I was just going to say either or is fine with me, so I'm good.
So I think we do need to maybe set up another meeting sometime next week after Election Day, or early on in the week. Well, that's Veterans Day too. Maybe the 12th or the 13th. Have a meeting then. because we will need to, the goal is to get these in the report, and the report is due either on the 14th or the 15th.
It's the 15th.
The 15th. All right.
I mean, just as a question, right? I mean, is it not, and I don't know if this is where Evie was going, but possible to do both on the 15th, or are we just required to have another meeting in between? Because there are a lot of things going on in, the next couple weeks.
Yeah, I know. Folks are getting their bills ready. So, so the 18th, we have another meeting scheduled. Yeah, and everyone should be on there. That is where we are going to be reporting out on the University of Maryland and Johns Hopkins research in this area. I have a feeling that's going to take up a good chunk of that meeting. So I think we're going to need another one at some point. And I'm fine. Well,
How long do you think the presentation part will take?
I would probably turn that over to maybe Stephanie or Kathleen Yvonne, if you know.
Yeah, we could probably do it within, I mean, it'd be pushing it, I think, with 30 minutes. I think ideally maybe 45.
If that's the case, we can probably
Let's do it on the 18th then.
do it on the 18th, and then we will add the recommendations as an addendum to the report. But I will still send out the Google Sheet to the members because we'll use that as the voting mechanism.
Okay.
All right, cool.
Go.
We'll get wait, we have to open up to the public. So gonna open this meeting up to the public. If there's any comments, questions, clarifications, anything like that. Pascal?
Yeah, I would just say that I provided some comments in the chat regarding reuse, just some of the concerns in the industry about that. So I'll defer to those comments in the interest of time.
Yeah, and we can, oh, did you have another comment, Pascal?
I do not.
Okay, I can read those out for the record. So reuse is not a well-developed market. Currently, most reused panels get shipped overseas, where it isn't known whether panels will be properly disposed of at the end of life or recycled. New panels with warranties are close to the cost of reused panels, so it's not likely that a viable reuse market will develop in the US. Also, there are no safety certifications for reused panels. UL has raised safety concerns about reused panels. Then it is common for panels to break during transportation. How would you determine whether breakage was reasonable or unreasonable? So I think that was with the workforce development, and I think we're doing that more with training. And then, oh yeah, did you have some context you wanted to add to that?
No, I agreed. I think where you ended up with that one was good.
Yep, and
That's
should
good.
clarify that panel breakage transportation isn't common, but most breakage happens during transportation or installation. And then Washington State recently proposed a 4-year delay in their product stewardship law due to difficulties getting manufacturers to sell into the state for new utility scale projects. And that's actually something that we discussed at our last meeting as well. Cool. Well, thanks so much, everyone. I will make sure I will get these out to folks, and then we can move forward.
All right, thank you, Bradley.
Yep, thank you. Have a nice day.
Thanks, Bradley.
Thank you.